Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Toms. I'm the director of the Institute for Research in the Social Sciences here at Stanford. I'm also a professor of political science and the chair of the political science department and a senior fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to America Votes 2024, Stanford Scholars on the election's most critical questions. The 2024 elections represent a pivotal moment for national and international politics. The elections could have a profound impact on domestic and foreign policy, as well as the structure of American political institutions and the future of American democracy. At Stanford, we are fortunate to have perhaps the greatest group of election experts in the world. My colleagues and I organized this series to share the incredible expertise of our Stanford colleagues with the campus community and the wider world.
Apparently that's not on. That's what I'm seeing. Oh, no. But use mine. Just use mine.
Okay.
Yep. You're doing great. Now it's great. Yes.
I won't repeat what I just said, but hello.
That's
We will host 4 panel discussions this fall. Our session today, followed by sessions on October 16th, October 30th, and November 12th. Each discussion will feature several Stanford experts who will make brief presentations about their research as it relates to the 2024 election, and then engage in a lively dialogue with each other and with you, the audience. This series is the fruit of a wonderful collaboration among 3 institutions here at Stanford. And there'll be a quiz on the acronyms CDDRL, RAI, and IRIS. Actually, for those who haven't mastered the acronyms yet, CDDRL is the Center for Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, housed here at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. RAI is the Center for Revitalizing American Institutions, housed at the Hoover Institution. And IRIS is the Institute for Research in the Social Sciences, housed within the School of Humanities and Sciences at Stanford. I'd like to thank my colleagues at CDDRL, RAI, and IRIS for making this series possible and express my gratitude in advance to our esteemed panelists for their participation in this series. I'm now going to pass the baton to one of my co-organizers, Professor Brandis Keynes-Roane. Brandis is the founding director of the Center for Revitalizing American Institutions. She's also a professor of political science and my colleague in the department and a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. She will say a few words today, and then we'll get to see her again in 2 weeks' time when, as a panelist, she will share some of her research on the 2024 presidential election in historical context. So, Brandis, let me give the floor to you.
maybe a microphone to be safe.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks to all of you for coming. So RAI is a new center at Stanford, and we're committed to supporting core research that analyzes how American institutions are operating today and proposing reforms, and then disseminating that research. So this series is a great place to be collaborating in terms of bringing Stanford experts, some of whom are affiliated with the center and some of whom we hope will do more with the center over time, to talk about this immediate issue of the elections. And with that, I want to turn to our amazing panelists and introduce Catherine Stoner. So Catherine is the director of CDDRL, which I now don't need to remember whether which comes first, democracy or development, since Mike has already explained it. Catherine is also a fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute, so another acronym, FSI, a senior fellow. Here, she's a courtesy member of the political science department and a courtesy senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. Her own research primarily focuses on Russia. She's one of the world experts on post-communist Russia, but she writes as well on topics related to transition economies and political economies outside of in post-communist nations outside of Russia, and has a number of books, many of them written and collaborated with our colleague Mike McFall, but also a number of her own solo authored work. So one thing I'm excited about in this panel, while many of the people on it, like myself, will focus on US institutions, understanding the United States is not possible if we don't think about how what's happening in the United States relates to the broader trends across the globe on trends such as populism and authoritarianism. So we're thrilled that some of our speakers today will bring in those topics. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Catherine.
Thank you, Brandis, and thank you, Mike, and welcome everyone. It was so convenient that the vice presidential candidates this year had a debate. I guess that's what it was last night as a sort of warm up for the crowd here. So as Brandis said, my name is Catherine Stoner. I'm a senior fellow here at the Freeman Spogli Institute, and I need to say and happily say I am the Mossbacher director of the Center on, not for, until after 5 p.m. Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, which is based just downstairs here in the Freeman Spogli Institute. And it's our pleasure to get to collaborate with Iris and with RAI and bring you this series, which we hope will bring in more and more of the Stanford community. And we know we're cannibalizing our in-house audience by also offering on Zoom. It's my job to introduce our panel today, our first panel, and also to sort of give you some of the ground rules. So each of our panelists will speak for about 12 to 15 minutes, uninterrupted, if you don't mind. And then I will, as moderator, maybe pose a question or two, and then we will turn to you. I believe the chat on Zoom has been turned off. So apologies for the frustration on that. It just becomes a little too complicated, I think, to try and take questions from Zoom as well. So with that, 2024 is a year of elections. And obviously we here in the United States have been very much focused on the US. But there have been elections in 70 countries this year alone, covering about half the population of the world. And while they're elections, they're not necessarily democratic elections. And so we will bring in some comparison, as Brandis said, to the United States. But our focus, of course, in this series is primarily the United States. Our first panelist, who will set the table this afternoon, for us in a comparative sense and look also at democratic backsliding, is Beatrice Magaloni, who is a vision in white next to me, vision in black. I guess I study autocracies more now these days, so it makes total sense, Beatrice is the Graham H. Stewart Professor of International Relations at the Department of Political Science. She is also a senior fellow here through CDDRL at the Freeman Spogli Institute. She is the director of CDDRL's Poverty, Violence, and Governance Lab, which she also founded. And her research focuses on the political economy of development. Her work has covered in the study of authoritarian regimes, violence, public security and human rights, non-state forms of governance, distributive politics, and the provision of public goods. Most of her research has been in Latin America. She's the author of a number of books on autocracy, including Voting for Autocracy, The Political Logic of Poverty Relief, and she's co-authored with Alberto Diaz-Calleros and Federico Estevez as well, that book. In 2023, and I'll just boast about you for a moment, she won the very prestigious Stockholm Prize in Criminology, which is the world's most noted and prestigious award in the field of criminology, that is considered the equivalent of the Nobel Prize in the field of criminology. In awarding it to her, the jury said, the 2023 winner of the prize in criminology, Stockholm Prize in Criminology, is the leading scholar in the world for demonstrating that major changes in policing can increase compliance with the rule of law under the challenges of high violence levels and strong demand to reduce crime. So we're thrilled to have Beatrice come and speak with us, today. She's going to look at the U.S. elections in a world of democratic backsliding. But before she does that, I will now introduce Shanto Iyengar, who's seated at the far end of our little stage here. He is the William Robertson Co-Professor and Professor of Political Science and of Communication here at Stanford. Shanto has been here since 1998. Is that right? Yes, right. As professor of political science, and he is the director of the Political Communication Laboratory as well. His areas of expertise include the role of mass media in democratic societies, public opinion, and political psychology. He is also working on the polarization lab. Here he studies media, politics, political communication as well. And his most recent book, Media Politics, A Citizen's Guide, is in its 5th edition, something we should all aspire to, just came out again in 2022. Shanto will speak on the campaign strategy in an era of polarization. And finally, seated between the two first speakers is our third speaker, Nate Persily, who is the James B. McClatchy Professor of Law at Stanford Law School. And although he's a lawyer, he's also a political scientist and a nice guy. Just joking, Nate. Had to make a lawyer joke. I'm sorry.
You're just joking that I'm a nice guy?
Oh, right. No. That part is true. He is also a senior fellow here at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. I'm going to claim you also for CDDRL, but you have a side hustle as co-director of the Cyber Policy Center here as well. He also has an appointment in the Department of Political Science and in Communications. He is not just the co-director, but the founding co-director of our Cyber Policy Center. Nate not only is a prolific scholar, but he also has done a great deal of work on consulting and advising and writing opinions for various judicial authorities on how, well, gerrymandering, I'll just say it, how votes are administered. And so appropriately, he's going to talk to us about the all-important and increasingly important issue that ended last night's debate, and that is administering the 2024 election and hopefully the acceptance of results. So let's begin with Beatrice. I'm not sure if I still need to hold my mic, but you might want to make sure you turn yours on. And then after Beatrice, we'll move to Shanto and then to Nate. Thank you.
Although I switched to.
So your mic's on?
Yeah, I think so.
Yes.
Yeah, yep. Great. So I'm very excited. Thank you so much for the invitation to talk today. And I'm really pleased that the 3 different centers at Stanford are coming together to foster this important dialogue about the elections this year. So thanks for the 3 of you who are here and all of you who came to listen. So I'm going to put the US elections in the context of specifically democratic backsliding. These elections are really critical, and we know that democracy is at stake, not only in these elections, but has been declining in the US according to many measures. So I'm going to talk about how the US relates to this global trend, what is different, and what can we learn also from other countries to understand what's going on here. So the first thing that we want to know, this is political scientists, we know that democracy is coming waves. So we recognize 3 main waves of democracies. One is in the aftermath of World War I. Then the other wave of democracy comes after decolonization. And then at the end of the Cold War, there is the 3rd wave of democracy. So we see these waves of democracy, and that's really bright times for all of us who believe in this form of government. But also autocracies seem to come in waves. I must apologize if there are some typos in the presentation. I hadn't really prepared a presentation. I was coming to talk more on a panel and then heard somebody, you were sending slides, so I just did it quickly. So please forgive me for that. But we also see that now the globe is really experiencing a serious democratic recession. In any way we measure it, these are Freedom House indicators, the Economist Intelligence Unit, there is the Variety of Democracies data set, and there is also a lot of studies, okay, a lot of studies of people who focus on particular countries that unequivocally tells us that there is some decline in democracy. So this is 2005 to 2023. This is a measure of freedom, civil and political liberties, and then the Economist Intelligence Unit, which has a really interesting composite index of democracy, and they both show this deterioration of democracy. And interestingly, I focus on Latin America, as Catherine mentioned. So Latin America, according to this measure, is the region of the world where you have seen more backsliding. That's the way we call it, so recession of democracy. The Middle East, Eastern Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, and then the United States clearly in this measure is experiencing this backsliding. And this is some of the issues that are at stake in this election. So I want to give some examples of which countries in Latin America have experienced backsliding. I must begin by saying that in all of these cases, leaders come to power through elections that are generally assumed to be free and fair. They are competitive, and then little by little, they undermine democratic institutions to the point that you can no longer distinguish when democracy ends. So we have Venezuela under Chavez and now Maduro, Hungary under Viktor Orban and his party Fidesz, Nicaragua under Daniel Ortega, Peru under Fujimori, and today's Peru, what we call democratic Halloween, that I will talk a little bit more about, that Brazil under Jair Bolsonaro. But then there was an important reversal of this backsliding that I think is very relevant for the US case, and I'll talk a little bit more about that after the election of Lula Ignacio da Silva in 2022. El Salvador currently under Bukele's and his iron fist approach to combating crime that is really troublesome in terms of human rights abuses and also how much power he has concentrated, violating the constitution, etc. We have India under Modi, but again, in the last elections in this summer, like Brazil, we see a reversal of this backsliding because he was not able to win the majority that he thought he could, and now he has to form coalitions to form a government. So that seems to be halting that backsliding, but all of them are similar processes. So what are the common elements? And I'll talk a little bit about what I see is going on in the US and what is obviously very different from the Maduro regime in Venezuela and the US today. So we observe in general an erosion of democratic norms. I'll talk a little bit more about that. The emergence of populist leaders, right-wing or left-wing, who tend to mobilize voters in terms of the politics of resentment. So they are anti-immigrant, anti-urban elites, anti-male, they embrace male grievances, white supremacy, anti-globalization. So this is the language of these populist leaders that follow this sort of affective polarization, us versus them approach. So growing political polarization, that also comes with more political violence, and I'll talk about that, and declining civil liberties. Okay, I see the US as experiencing some of these problems. And then obviously then we see very different dynamics in cases that went all the way to really dying their democracy. So the leader in these cases, it concentrates power to undermine the existing institutions, so checks and balances, judicial independent, electoral tribunals, central banks in general. The leader is able to amass a lot of political power so that no longer checks and balances exist. They often eliminate term limits, undermine the independence of the media, and then at the end, they of course use the coercive apparatus of the state to jail, torture, and kill their opponents. So at that moment, we are really talking about a democracy that is already an autocracy, right? So fortunately, the US is not even, there is a typo there, there is not even close to most of these backsliding regimes. And part of it is because power is sufficiently divided among Democrats and Republicans between the state and the federal government to make it very difficult to form super majoritarian coalitions to undermine democratic institutions. So this is a very key difference, and it's very important. The power here is sufficiently fragmented so that it would be very hard for someone to amass that much power, such as Chavez, for example, did in Venezuela, to be able to change the constitution and then form institutions that are serving to the dictator. Although I should mention that Levinsky and Ziblatt, in their famous book about, the title is How Democracies Die, they argue that the US has profoundly anti-democratic institutions. So for example, the Electoral College is one of them. And by the way, Latin American constitutions originally copied the Electoral College, but we all got rid of the Electoral College really at the beginning of the 20th century or so. So why do we worry about the US? And I'm going to focus on this for problems that are also common in other democratic systems that we see today. So the first is the erosion of democratic norms, growing polarization, political violence, and declining civil liberties. So sorry about this, it has some Spanish on it. So the first thing is like the Freedom House, this is the Freedom House indicators, and as you could see, the US is ranked, it's on a scale from 0 to 100, it's ranked in 83, this is the latest one. So Uruguay is the most democratic country, Chile, Germany, and look at all the countries in Latin America. So we have a lot of really solid democracies, but also, as I mentioned, many autocracies. Even, so the US now is ranked below Argentina and Panama and above Brazil. So I'm going to focus between those two countries just for a minute and question whether that ranking is correct when looking at the erosion of democratic norms and violence. So if we compare Brazil and the US, both confronted very similar challenges when the Trump and President Bolsonaro had their supporters, the Capitol insurrection in January 6th, which is very, very similar to the uprising in January 8th in Brazil, where supporters of Bolsonaro took control of the federal government, contesting the elections in which Bolsonaro had clearly lost, very similar to what happened here in the US. And I want to highlight the very key differences between these two countries. So while here in the United States, the Republicans have close ranks behind Trump, and there has been no way to sanction this behavior, the Supreme Court recent immunity ruling makes it very unlikely that Trump would be ever punished because of the insurrection. Whereas in Brazil, prosecutors and courts barred Bolsonaro for running for office until 2030. And then a lot of the supporters that incite this violence were also sent to prison. So with this, the regime sent a very, very clear signal that this form of behavior is completely out of question. And I think this is a very big difference. So when you rank Brazil versus the US, I look at Brazil's institutions and they were actually more robust in defending one of the key elements of democracy, which is that everybody has to accept the outcome of the elections. So we can compare, for example, the United States with Peru. In 2021, there was an election, and then the far-right candidate, Keiko Fujimori, she was a contender. She contested the elections, claimed fraud. President Castillo took office, but he couldn't govern because Fujimori's allies in Congress, the army and extreme right conservatives opposed her. So Castillo eventually took office, but he couldn't govern with this opposition, and he did a self-coup, meaning he dissolved Congress, and then Congress impeached him, and now his vice president took office. And basically today, Peru is ungovernable. So these are some of the risks that come from the fact that the main political players, in this case, coming more from Trump, but also his supporters, do not agree about the basic rules of the game of democracy. And this really opens a lot of doors for political violence and the erosion of democracy. So this is one of the problems I observe, but we don't only observe political violence as a form of electoral violence, but increased and growing violence in general. So according to the global terrorism data set, there has been a 400% increase in the United States in terrorist attacks, mostly perpetrated by right-wing perpetrators. We saw, for example, during the 2020 elections that election officials were targeted. We've seen an attempt to kidnap the governor of Michigan, etc. So, and of course, the assassination attempt against Trump during these elections. So this is really telling us something that is very worrisome about the US, which is growing political violence. I must mention that this growing political violence is also going on in Germany and France, for example, which during the last elections of the European Union, there were attacks against local mayors. And in Brazil during Bolsonaro, there was a lot of political violence, also target against enemies, activists, and even indigenous groups. Mexico also has the most violent election in this year. So I want to end by saying, what are the causes of this violence? I mean, there is really not sufficient research that allows us to understand the sources of violence. I focus more on criminal violence, which is a huge problem in Latin America, but also related to politics. And people have been highlighting issues like polarization that leads towards taking attitudes and behaviors that are really violent. And I'm going to not go in detail because I don't have more time, but I'm going to end just, so we talked about the erosion of consensus with respect to the democratic rules of the game. That's a very big problem. And I also mentioned other countries that have had these issues. By the way, the fact that Trump contested the elections in that way inspired Bolsonaro and also Fujimori. So these autocrats around the world copy themselves. So this is worrisome. These languages travel. But I want to end up with the problem. I also mentioned growing political violence, polarization, that I'm going to leave that for Shanta to talk more about. But I want to end with a concern on the decline of civil liberties. We saw that very much happening during Bolsonaro's regime. Liberties of political activists, but also, for example, indigenous peoples in the Amazons who were just, they were really destituted from their lands by extractive industries and Bolsonaro, and through violence, and Bolsonaro was really supportive of these actions. And what worries me the most here is about the threats that Trump has done on mass deportations of immigrants here in the United States. We already saw during his administration the family separation policy that unquestionably caused serious human rights violations, and the promise to deal with this problem with mass deportations using the army and detention centers, again, tells us about the potential for civil liberties to be seriously undermined. And this is another of the aspects that I see common in this, and what it's at stake in these elections relative to what we observed in other countries. So I think that if Trump wins the election, there is really a huge setback for democracy. That's my opinion as a scholar. But I also think that this is a setback for democracy, not only here, but as I mentioned, autocrats copy themselves, and this is really troublesome. So these waves that I began saying, democracy comes in waves. Similarly, these strategies diffuse across countries. So those are my remarks.
Share your microphone.
Good.
Thanks.
What's presenter view or slide? No, slide view is fine. Okay. Okay, remind you, my name's Shanta Iyengar, and I'm here to talk about campaign strategy in an era of polarization. So Beatrice mentioned the troubling symptoms of polarization in the United States. I'll elaborate a little bit on that, but mainly what I'm going to talk about this evening is the implications of polarization for the behavior of candidates, so the strategy that campaigns deploy in the field, so to speak. So I'm sure you're all tuning in to the 2024 campaign, and so some of the things I'll be referencing are sort of very current. Okay, so when I speak of polarization, I'm really constant that there are multiple ways of defining polarization. In political science, there's a long tradition of work comparing people's ideological profile. So there's people who are far left, people far right. That's the standard definition, but more recently, we've been thinking about polarization in terms of affect. That is to say, how people who support either of the major parties, how do they feel about their opponents? Do they consider their opponents to be decent human beings? Well, the answer is not really. Over the last 30 or 40 years, there's a lot of data, which, and I'll show you a couple of, maybe one slide, on surveys in which people are asked to evaluate political parties and supporters of the political parties. And in the last 30 years, these evaluations have turned very, very hostile. There's a lot of negativity in partisans' assessments of their opponents. And it's not just political attitudes that have been affected, but it turns out that the party queue, that is to say, whether or not you're a Democrat or a Republican, that is now a sort of a litmus test that dictates your social interactions, the composition of your social networks. So there are a lot of studies that show that spousal agreement. If you look at American households today, and you ask, what's the percentage of households in which people have the same party registration? Well, it's very high. It's over 80%, whereas in the 1960s, it was barely around 60%. So this idea that because people have become so polarized politically and they see their opponents as existential threats, they are disinclined to socialize or interact with people from the opposing side. So in that sense, you get this idea that we're all living in a sort of a echo chamber. And there are lots of studies that go on to show that party queues have now become relevant in a variety of non-political domains. Most notably, of course, during the pandemic, we have these massive differences in vaccination rates, social distancing, the practice of social distancing, or mask wearing. Clearly, Republicans following the rhetoric of Republican elites were much less inclined to engage in those behaviors. And considering the sort of the high stakes involved in terms of public health behavior, in many cases this could be a life and death type of decision. That seems to be a pretty strong test of the power of the partisan queue. And again, there's a lot of research and evidence suggesting that there is actual behavioral discrimination. The partisans are willing to donate less money when they know they're playing with someone from the other side. Okay, so here's the one. This is the one data slide on polarization that I'm going to show you. This is a pretty well documented. This graph has appeared in multiple papers. So the ANES is the American National Election Studies, and I wanted to put in a plug for the Institute for Research in the Social Sciences, because IRIS is actually the home base for the Stanford component of ANES, and IRIS, of course, is one of the sponsoring entities for this event. So the ANES has been in existence since 1952. I'm only showing you the time series in the last 4 decades or so. So what do I mean by party thermometers? Well, we have a question there in which people are asked to evaluate a variety of groups and individuals. And in this case, we're asking people to evaluate the Democratic and Republican parties on a scale from 0 to 100. So a score of 0 would indicate that you feel extremely cold, i.e. You're not exactly enamored of the group you're evaluating. And a score of 100 would mean you're super positive. So what we're showing you here is the green line, the Democrats' rating of the Democratic Party and the Republicans' rating of the Republican Party. So that's the in-party rating. The blue line is the opposite, the ratings of the opposing party. And as you can see, beginning in around 1990 or the early 1990s, you begin to see a very steep decline in people's evaluations of the opposing party. And of course, the gold line is the difference between the in-party and the out-party rating. That's the measure of polarization. In 2020, by the way, so the thermometer goes from 0 to 100. I would just point out that the ANES is it's a dinosaur in the sense that it still uses personal interviews. There's an interviewer sitting in front of you asking these questions. And so given what we know about various biases that affect survey responses, the social desirability bias, for example, people don't like to come across as being super impolite or super hostile. So you might imagine that there is some sort of, no one's going to say zero when you're asked to evaluate a group or individual. And of course, when you look at the numbers for things like, we ask them to evaluate Hindus and Muslims and atheists, a variety of groups, people are very guarded. The ratings tend to hover around between 40 and 60. In 2020, however, when people were asked to evaluate Democratic or Republican Party, the modal response, that is to say, the response with the most, where you've got most traffic, is zero. Okay, so that's a pretty striking finding. So it's not just that they are hostile; they're super hostile. Now I want to show you a clip. So this is adult data, but there's another way of thinking about polarization. What happens when you look at the attitudes of young kids? So CNN last week, Anderson Cooper, the audience for Anderson Cooper is about 2 million. So I'm assuming, given that's less than 0.75% of the adult population, I'm guessing there's no one in this room who watched this clip. So I'm going to show you a 20-second clip. This is a really long, it's a 10-minute long report in which the team, the Anderson Cooper team, interviewed these 10-year-olds from 3 different states and just asked them a bunch of open-ended questions about Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. So here's a snippet of, okay, I guess I need a mouse, Chris, to get it to play. No.
What's the first word that pops into your head when you hear the name Kamala Harris?
Liar.
What's the first word that pops into your head when you hear Donald Trump?
Pure evil.
Which one do you think is more selfish?
Like selfish, probably her.
Kamala Harris?
Yeah, because girls are a little bit dramatic sometimes.
And do you think that people in the United States are ready to have another 4 years of Donald Trump if he's reelected?
No,
Why not?
Because like I feel like all he does is like complain and like yell.
So that's just a sample. So it's polarization has trickled down to the level of elementary school children. So it's kind of symptomatic of where we are. Okay, so what does this all mean for the people on the campaign trail, and what are the implications for campaign strategy when you've got this level of hostility out there in the electorate? Well, the first thing is persuading people to defect from their party is now pretty much impossible, because the partisans see a victory for the opposition as being, that's pretty threatening. And so the only persuasion that is going to occur today is really that's targeting people who have no party affiliation. In the political science jargon, people we call pure independents, people who have no affiliation whatsoever. So in the old days, campaigns, the high priority was assigned to making sure that relatively few partisans would stray from voting the party line. That's no longer a high priority, because I'm going to show you some data. But pretty much, if you're a strong partisan, the probability that you're going to vote for your party, it's almost a perfect. It's almost 100%. The other thing I would say is that the level of out-party animus is a strong incentive for politicians to engage in a particular form of campaigning, which is to emphasize the sort of the demerits, if you will, of the opposition. So negative campaigning, the use of sort of attack advertising. So I'll show you some evidence that that's now the dominant strategy. Almost every political ad you see coming out on the Republican side is an attack on Harris-Biden track record. So it's interesting that partisans might be more responsive to these sorts of attack-oriented messages, but independents, it turns out, since they're not part of that us versus them logic, they tend to be more responsive to positive messages. And so we'll see in a minute, I'll show you the data that the Harris campaign has actually been far more positive in the tone of their campaign. And obviously, if persuasion is less relevant, then the campaigns are going to be much more concerned with getting out the vote. So both parties are going to be investing heavily in mobilization or demobilization attempts. So here's data from the last 3 cycles. The black bar is the attack definition of an attack ad is that it's 100% focusing on the opponent. Now, the consultants, you don't want to be seen as someone who only uses attacks, and so the consultants have developed this classification of a contrast ad. If you look at the text of a contrast ad, there may be 12 sentences in it. One sentence says something positive about the sponsoring candidate. 11 sentences are attacks on the opponent. That's what a contrast ad. So for all practical purposes, those are negative messages. So if you add up contrast and attack, you can see the vast majority of advertising in American presidential elections is of the negative variety. The purely positive, the ad in which you only say good things about yourself, that's a very tiny slice of the pie. More recently, if you look at the Biden-Trump, the Biden-Harris and the Trump campaigns, you can see this is broken down by week. So if you look, let's just focus on the bottom, which is the percentage of all ads. So again, we've got attack, contrast, and promote. If you look at the Democratic flow of advertising, you can see that it's mainly a contrast and attack. In the early phase, that's when Biden is in the race. But then you see in the last 5 bars or so, you see when Kamala Harris takes over, you can see there's a very high proportion of positive messages. She's a new face. She's just acquired the nomination. And so there's this logic in campaigning that you first have to introduce yourself. And so there's a lot of biographical material in that early phase. But the point is, you can see that there's a lot of positivity in the Democratic ad campaign. Whereas if you look on the Republican side, there's no positive messaging at all. It's entirely attack or contrast. So that's something you might want to keep your eye on. Given what I said about independence, it's possible that the Harris campaign's message may be resonating to a greater degree among independents than does the Republican message. Okay, so now I'm going to just show you some time series data. If you want to track the effects of campaigns on the behavior of voters, the best design is to have a long-standing time series data set in which you interview people on a daily basis. So in 2000, as a baseline, I'm going to use this very famous National Annenberg election study, which interviewed about 200 people a day for the entire year of the 2000 presidential election, over 100,000 cases in total. Yeah, I'm almost done. The 2004 data is from the PRL daily surveys of about 100 people a week in the 2024 campaign. So as you can see, the percentage of strong partisans, that's the top line there, over 90% of strong partisans are voting for their party in this cycle. Whereas in 2000, there's a pretty significant drop-off. That's polarization. The strong partisans are now just automatically voting for their party. The weak partisans, as you can see, in 2024, the weak partisans over time, there's a pretty steep slope. They're increasingly towing the party line, whereas in 2000, there was a considerable, the defection rate was significantly higher. So polarization basically has made partisans super loyal. The flip side of that, of course, is defection. I'm not going to bother about this since it's just the opposite. Minimal defection today, strong partisans are defecting at almost zero. So it's the same point. How are independents reacting? Well, I thought you might be interested in this. The Trump seems to have a slight edge among independents in the PRL time series, but it's the vast majority of independents, however, are undecided, not planning on not voting or supporting a third-party candidate. Okay, debates. Obviously, that's a big deal in campaigns. In 2024, we've had some unprecedented debates. So as you can see, the first debate, which was a disaster for Biden, you can see that weak and leaning Democrats, their support for the Democratic ticket is significantly lowered. Strong Democrats, on the other, again, you have to ask yourself, what would it have taken? What would Biden have to do to lose the support of the strong Democrats? He'd probably have to collapse on the debate stage. Okay, so I'm going to skip over that. This is the Harris-Trump debate, where you get, again, this noticeable uptick in Democratic support in the aftermath of that debate. And of course, what we know is that when there's media commentary, that tends to sort of amplify the effects of a one-sided debate. Okay, so wrapping up, there's relatively few persuadable voters in the election. And the other problem is that those who are high on persuadability, i.e. the pure independents, they're also low on media exposure. And so if you're not tuning in, it's unlikely that you're going to be persuaded. So campaigns are therefore investing more heavily in targeted mobilization efforts. I will say, however, that there's good data that campaigns do educate voters, so to speak. The percentage of people who are able to offer opinions on the candidate's personal traits and issue positions increases significantly over time. And finally, as this current cycle suggests, high-profile events and media encounters still have the capacity to shape public opinion. So campaigns still matter. Thank you.
Nate, make sure you're in.
Yep, it's on. So as the PowerPoint's going up there, I'll say that one thing Catherine left off is that I was the research director of the Presidential Commission on Election Administration. So, and we also started this program here at Stanford 4 years ago, the Stanford MIT Healthy Elections Project, which was focused on election administration issues. And so I'm going to talk about the election administration issues. But this is a half-hour presentation. Then I'm going to give them 15 minutes, and so I'll zip through some of the several of the slides. Let me just talk about what's changed since the 2020 election, because there was a question in the 2020 election whether we could even pull off the election. And if you remember Milwaukee in the primary election, 97% of the polling places were closed down. New York canceled, basically didn't count 20% of its absentee ballots in the mail ballots in the primary election. But as a result of the diligence of our election officials, we were able to pull off an incredible feat, which is 160 million people ended up voting in that election. And despite 63 lawsuits scrutinizing that election, no significant problems were found. It's remarkable because, this was in the face of a pandemic. You might have thought if anything's going to retard turnout, it would be the pandemic. But because of a lot of interest in the election, mobilization, we didn't see that. So what's happened since 2020? Well, nearly every state has changed its laws in one way or another, some more restrictive, some more permissive when it comes to voting. A third of the election officials has resigned. It might even be closer to 40%. In the face of death threats, social media scrutiny, and their jobs being basically made miserable. The norms regarding political violence have been degraded by what happened on January 6th, as well as I think we could probably throw in the assassination attempts with respect to that as well. There's been a collapse in confidence in the election administration infrastructure, at least among a third of the population, and I'll show you some data on that. As well as, and I note this, it might not seem relevant yet, but a loss of confidence in the Supreme Court, so that if we were to have a Bush versus Gore style situation in the 2024 election, we should not be under the delusion that it's going to play out in the same way that it did 24 years ago. There are other changes that have happened, something if I have time, I'll talk about. Certain, what we're seeing as nonpartisan efforts to deal with voter registration, like the Electronic Registration Information Center, have now been polarized, and several Republican states have seceded from that effort. But on the good side, there is a new law, the Electoral Count Reform Act, which has been overhauled to try to help with the issues of certification to prevent another January 6th. It makes clear that the vice president has a ministerial role, so that, say, Mike Pence wasn't able to, have an effect on the counting the electoral slates, and that would be true for Kamala Harris now, as well as trying to force some contestation related to the electoral slates earlier in the process. On the kind of social media side, this is a very different social media world than existed in the 2020 election. It is much more fractured. The conversion of Twitter to X makes this a very different world. Facebook has demoted a lot of political content. That's the way it's tried to deal with things. But a lot of the countermeasures that had been tried by platforms to deal with disinformation are not going to be present this time because of both mistakes they made, say, with the Hunter Biden laptop fiasco, as well as with political pressure that's been brought to bear against them. And then in this environment, we've got the rise of AI, which is, I'll say, I don't think is a significant problem, but it does further erode people's faith in the truth of what they're seeing. So let me talk about how to panic responsibly about this election. Okay, here are what I'm calling secondary concerns, and then I'll talk about the things I'm worried about. There is a lot of talk about vote suppression laws and voter fraud, of course. As I mentioned, a lot of these laws that were passed over the last 4 years, some of them, have really motivation to suppress the vote, racial discrimination, you can list them. I do not think in a presidential election year that it's actually going to have much of an effect on turnout, either in the aggregate or, say, minority voter turnout, okay? And I can explain why that is. That doesn't mean you should love these laws, but that in a presidential election year, because of the mobilization and because of the amount of money that's put into the process, that I don't think it's going to affect turnout. That doesn't mean vote suppression won't happen. It's that's for the right side of the column here. It's just the laws themselves I don't think are going to have that effect. Same thing with voter fraud for reasons that I think we've tested, although in an environment, and this sort of picks up on Beatrice's points, which is that in an environment where a third of the population has lost confidence in the election, the likelihood that someone engages in kind of ultra-virus behavior because they figure, well, the whole system is corrupt, I think makes it more likely. AI deepfakes, I don't think we're seeing either in the United States or around the world having much of an impact. That was a majority of Americans in polls has repeatedly said that they worry that AI is going to determine the outcome of the 2024 election. But what we've seen is that the most sort of frequent use of AI or concerns about AI is for politicians to disclaim true things, not for people to start behaving false things. And actually, over time, what we've seen as researchers in this area is that people are becoming better at discerning what's false. They're becoming worse at discerning what's true. And that is actually maybe a greater danger to democracy over the long term. But in terms of the independent effect that AI is going to have, I don't think it's going to be significant. Similarly, when it comes to foreign social media influence operations, and you may have seen that the Department of Justice alerted to Russian and I believe Iranian influence on this a few weeks ago. Look, for the same reason that AI deepfakes are probably not going to have much of an impact, there is just so much crap in the social media universe right now that for this stuff to actually make a difference, it's really, I think, just an error term around the edges. Now, that doesn't mean that foreign action, for example, cyber attacks, which is something I am concerned about, or taking down the electrical grid or other kinds of violence, that is not a concern. That is. But when it comes to the information environment, I don't think it's going to make much of a difference. So what am I concerned about mostly? Again, these are secondary concerns. Not that I'm not concerned about them, just secondary. The primary concerns are what I would put under the general rubric of confusion and disorder, and both among voters and election officials, because as I mentioned before, we've got a third of the election officials have never run a presidential election before, and they're doing so under new laws, under death threats and incredible social media scrutiny. Disorder in early voting, election day locations or counting centers, poll watching and challenges, especially now that something like ERIC is no longer, there are sort of substitute efforts to deal with purges of registration lists, and there could be some challenges in the polling place, which I don't think are going to amount to a whole lot, but it could cause disorder. This is not a political environment in which disorder in polling places is going to be well received. I'm as concerned about violence, a perception of violence, as I am about violence. I think that if there is something that happens in these polling places, that the perception that it's widespread could itself have a chilling effect on turnout, which concerns me. I mentioned cyber attacks before, but I'm also just concerned about the number of ballots that might end up being contested, because for the reasons I said before, that this is not a political system that can handle a Bush versus Gore style controversy in a single state. The efforts that are being made right now, essentially to create a situation where there's a lot of contested ballots, I think are posing a danger to the election. Now let me talk about how we vote and what's going to happen in this election. So you can see that we've had this steady decline in election day voting up through the 2020 election, and then it actually bumps up a little bit in the 2022 election. But the majority of people voted by mail or early voting in 2020, right? So close to about 60% or more, almost 70%. Whereas it's sort of half and half in the elections after that. Among the those who are, there is a partisan split in mail balloting, which then leads to, if one were to engage in messing with the system, there's greater predictability as to who is voting by what means, although the Republicans are now trying to do a mail ballot outreach program in this election. And so the problems related to mail balloting, because that is certainly a location of frequent conspiracy theories. The National Association of Secretaries of State and National Associations of State Election Directors have actually issued a letter already, bipartisan, telling the Postal Service, you got to get your act together, because when I teach election administration to my students, one of the things I tell them is, look, unlike every other place in the world, we don't have a national election authority in the United States. If you had to actually identify which federal agency is most responsible for elections, it's actually the Postal Service. And so they will be delivering around a fourth or more of the ballots in this election. And so what they do is quite important, especially if, if we bounce back to maybe not what was happening during the pandemic, but something close to it. I continue to be mystified by the range of conspiracy theories around ballot drop boxes, right? So you may remember there was a whole set of conspiracy theories about people dumping ballots in drop boxes. We've always had drop boxes in the United States. They were big and blue, and they were outside of postal offices, right? And so there's nothing about the process of putting something into a receptacle that somehow should then lead to a conspiracy theory. But there's a whole movie made about this, saying that this flipped the election, that people are just throwing ballots in there. But then you should expect, and there are examples of this previously, concerns about surveillance around drop boxes and conspiracy theories as a result. There is a lot of litigation right now. There's over 100 lawsuits that are still unresolved related to this election, related to things like the matching of signatures and whether an election official can help a voter cure a problem that they've decided they've discovered in the validation process. There is now going up to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court again, this issue as to whether ballots that are received on time, but which have the incorrect date on them, whether they will be canceled, and that would be thousands of ballots if you look at previous elections. And there's litigation in the Fifth Circuit where they're trying to get a national injunction to prevent the counting of any late arriving ballots after Election Day, saying that the federal election date, which is specified by statute, prevents the counting of late ballots. That, by the way, that would be millions of ballots. I don't think there's going to be success there, but you never know what might come of that. I mentioned the curing issue, the issue of ballot harvesting, which is related to drop boxes. There's several states, the most notable are Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, that ban what we call pre-processing, that they're not allowed to start counting the votes or opening, not just count, validating the mail ballots before Election Day. And so that slows down the count, although there's reason to think that maybe they're prepared and it's not going to happen this time. And then, because I think perceptions are as bad as realities in this situation, that the delays in counting, as we saw last time, are what feed some of these conspiracy theories about manipulation by internal election officials. I'll just point out that there are certain states where, in all of these states that have asterisks, military ballots are allowed to be received. These are battleground states. These are NCSL statistics, National Conference of State Legislature. In Nevada, so long as the ballots are received by November 9th, they will still be counted. Okay, so if Nevada is a close election, it's several days before you'll actually get those. Here in California, we get 3 more weeks, right? That's why California is like the latest in counting its mail ballots. But most of these states also allow for voters several days after the election to cure problems. 3 minutes? Okay. All right. Let me talk about after polls close. So the results could take days. There are different candidates will lead at different times, so-called mirages and waves. Attention and security concerns will turn to the counting centers. And we should be concerned about when you think about hacking, the election night reporting systems are, I think, soft targets. If you're worried about the effect that it's going to end up having on people's perceptions, that you could easily see different candidates pulling ahead and falling behind. Let me just talk a little bit about the delayed reporting of results and what we saw in 2020. So after 2 days, Arizona had only counted 88% of its ballots, all right? Different states had different trends in 2020, right? Where Georgia and Michigan basically had counted all their ballots. As I mentioned now, Pennsylvania and Wisconsin banned pre-processing. But if you look at the states that in red here that banned pre-processing in the 2020 election, they are about 8 hours or six hours behind the average ones that didn't have bans on pre-processing. And so after 24 hours, it's basically a tide as to they are able to catch up, but a lot can happen in those intervening times. It's fashionable to say that what happens, right, is that you have Republicans are leading on election night, and then that's what we call a red mirage, and then a blue wave comes when they count absentee ballots. That's actually not uniformly the case. So if you look at, like, say, Arizona, where Biden was up after 4 hours, he was up by almost 4 percentage points in Arizona, one of the reasons Fox News called it so early. But then as you progressed, actually Republicans did better as the days wore on. And so what the moral of the story here, and you can see this in these graphs, which is that if it's blue, that means it was erroneously reported as pro-Biden in the first 4 hours, or excessively pro-Biden. Red would be pro-Trump. That and then purple is accurate. That different states, it's going to be a hodgepodge, right? So when polls close, we're not really going to know necessarily like what happens when the mail ballots are counted. I mentioned before, one of the things that I'm worried about is lack of confidence in the accuracy of elections. And so that's been declining principally because, as you see now, 28% of Republicans say that they are very somewhat confident that the president votes for the president will be accurately cast and counted in this year's election. As with some other phenomena with public opinion, people tend to be confident that their vote will be counted. They're just suspicious about other people's votes, right, in the nation. All right, last set of points, and that is on certification. You probably heard a lot of these controversies coming out of Georgia about the possibility that local election officials are not going to certify the election. There's this report by CREW, Center for Responsible Ethics in Washington or something like that, saying that it notes 35 election officials who have refused to certify elections. What does that mean? So first, just because a local election official puts their fingers in the ears and says, I'm not going to certify, I'm not going to certify, does not mean that they can hold up the election of the president, right? This will lead to court action. This will lead to compelling these local officials to certify the results. And even so, even if they refuse, the critical question is at the state level. And in all of the battleground states, we have officials who I think are empowered and will deal with this problem. And so while there's a lot of litigation and concern about this, I don't think it's going to turn into a big problem. But I cannot predict right now what the issue is going to be in this election. And that's part of the difficulty. If you go back to 2020, whether it was Sharpie Gate in Arizona, which was the use of Sharpie markers to saying that if you use a Sharpie marker to vote, that it wasn't going to be counted. Or there were bamboo fibers in the ballot, so that suggests that there were votes in China that were being kind of smuggled into Arizona. Italian satellites were affecting the electronic voting machines, or the long dead arm of Hugo Chavez was having an effect on this election, or Mark Zuckerberg, or of course Dominion Voting Systems, which has now led to hundreds of millions of dollars in defamation damages. Ballot harvesting I mentioned before, and drop boxes, all of these kinds of things are up, and they were rejected by courts in the 2020 election. What's going to be the issue this time? But here are some reasons for optimism. Look, for 95% or more of voters, they're not going to experience power problems in casting their vote. The fact that we have as much early voting as we do, it serves as a warning system if problems are developing, right? So the fact that we spread things out is better than, for example, if you had one day and a hurricane comes through on election day. State election officials in these battleground states are prepared for all of the stuff that I've mentioned. They're not going to be caught flat-footed, although, again, depending on whether we're talking about violence or other things, it's a concern. All of the ballots in the battleground states are going to be paper ballots. There's no reason for like conspiracy theories about electronic voting machines. And 98% of the ballots nationwide will be paper ballots. And look, the election might not be close, in which case, this is what we call the election administrator's prayer. Oh God, whatever happens, please don't let it be close, because if it is close, then the fragile underbelly of our election administration system then is seen as outcome determinant. Thank you.
Why don't you all come back up if you don't mind? And I'll turn on my microphone here. Thank you all very much. Since we're running, which is not your fault, it's actually our fault because we had so many wonderful things to say about one another at the beginning. Why don't I forego for the moment my questions, which are many, and turn to the audience, unless they don't put their hands up, and then I get a chance. Jim, okay, Jim Goldgeier is right here, is the first I saw. So here comes a microphone, and if people would wait and.
Yeah, thanks so much. Jim Goldgeier, I'm a research affiliate at CSEC and CDDRL. And
I don't think the mic's on.
so
Hold it real close.
Yes, no?
Yep.
I have a question for Shanto, although I do have to say one thing first, which is I teach a PhD seminar in IR at American University. I asked my students about how their comparative class was going and who was their favorite author they'd been reading so far in the semester. And first thing they said was Beatrice. So
Thank you.
without any problem. So Shanto, I have a question about whether your very clear presentation, whether it ever matters whether candidates can make a difference. And I say that as somebody who lives in Maryland, very blue state, very popular former Republican governor, Larry Hogan, who I know a lot of people who are going to vote for Hogan for Senate. I try to remind them of what's at stake with the Senate. Lots of Hogan signs in my neighborhood. One of my neighbors theorizes it's people who feel like that's a more polite way of showing that they are supporting Donald Trump. They can put a Hogan sign out and they don't have to. But it seems in that case anyway that a candidate can make a difference in terms of being able to get people from the other party to feel okay about voting for that person.
Well, that's an interesting example, the Hogan case, because he's got a track record as governor. So it's quite possible that in that case he might attract some crossover voting. But most of the data, unfortunately, if you look at candidates who have obvious flaws, so take the North Carolina case of Robinson. Even though he's trailing by about 20 points in the polls right now, I would guess that a majority of Republicans will end up voting for Robinson. So the overall impact of polarization has been that partisans are now willing. So it's the Trump comment about walking down Fifth Avenue. They're willing to overlook flaws in their own candidate because the probability of the importance of keeping the opponents out takes precedence. So I guess I would say, I'm encouraged by the example you mentioned of Hogan, but that it goes against the data which suggests that candidate traits. It used to be, the defection rate in 1972 among Democrats was, in the A&ES data, is almost 40%. McGovern was so off-putting that almost half of the Democrats voted for Nixon. But today, the defection rates, I mean, they're just almost zero.
Interesting. Okay, I know there was another question or two at the back. Nora, can't quite see who everyone is, but if you wouldn't mind standing and introducing yourself as well.
Hi, my name is Irene, and I work at Stanford University, actually in the engineering school. But thank you for your talk. This is
Welcome
super,
on this side of campus.
this is super interesting. My question for you is, can you speak to voter apathy and how it has, changed between 2020 and now, and especially if it has any nuance between different parties and between different age groups of voters?
We don't know. I mean, this is one of these things, which is that voter turnout has been up over the last few elections, right? I mean, as much as people talk about apathy, we had record voter turnout in 4 years ago. I don't know if we'll reach those levels. I think we'll probably approach but not reach those levels in this election. And sure, all of the same demographic characteristics that we've known for a long time that affect voting, like young people will not turn out in droves. There are lots of reasons about that. But I think it's too early to predict what the electorate's going to look like. And in some ways, that's why I don't want to say I don't believe the polls. It's like I don't know what to make of the polls because I don't know how to predict what this electorate is going to look like. I mean, people are not happy with the candidates, but that was true last time as well. And so it's very hard to predict what the structure of the electorate is going to look like.
Interesting. Okay, there's another question at the far back and then one up here.
Hi, my name is Mond. I'm a political science undergraduate. So one of the my question's for Professor Pursley. One of the most sort of iconic conspiracy images from 2020 is that one graph of Wisconsin's vote totals throughout the night, and it sort of has Trump leading all the way until 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. and then there was a big ballot drop that broke overwhelmingly for Biden, and that contributed to his win. And so that's that image is used as the evidence of electoral fraud. And so I think one striking thing about the way the United States announces or communicates election results is that they don't come all at once. They come over the course of several days. Small drops, big drops, depending on the county, can contribute to the blue mirage or the red mirage. And so for me, the place where I grew up, Zimbabwe, we have all 10 provincial election administrators from the different provinces come on TV at 8 p.m. and they all announce the results from their different provinces. In the UK, they had that big countdown on Sky News, and then all at once the exit poll results came out. And so you have this big announcement which sort of mitigates those conspiracies. My question is, between 2020 and now, has there anything changed about the way the election administrators approach communicating results and getting information out there in a way that discourages conspiratorial thinking? So how have they updated their approaches towards communication and that kind of stuff?
So there are certain changes that have happened in the last 4 years. So for example, Michigan, which didn't have pre-processing of ballots, now will have pre-processing of ballots. And that allows for them to validate so that the mail votes that are received before Election Day will basically be reported quickly. And so you'll get those dumps of reports. Part of what you're highlighting here is the incredible decentralization of election administration in the United States. And so we have, we vest a lot of the power in these local officials to report results. Now, as I mentioned before, I said there's no real national federal election authority in the United States, so Postal Service. The one that follows close behind is the Associated Press. Now, the Associated Press is basically the national validator of votes at this point, that they are the ones who people turn to for tallying the totals. And so when, pick your county, Santa Clara County releases its results and shows the progress, then those will be the results that the AP releases. The challenge is because it takes many days. The difference between all of the votes that are counted on Election Day and the final vote, there will be tens of millions of votes that are counted afterwards, and most of them are here in California, because it takes us many weeks. And so what you're suggesting, I don't know whether a single late-ish reporting of the vote totals would solve the conspiracy problems, because then people would be, just like in the waiting period, there will be all kinds of conspiracy theories. But it's because of the sheer diversity of the way that we run elections in this country and the decentralization that make that very difficult.
Beatrice.
I want to make you mentioned Zimbabwe, and again, thinking comparatively, a lot of countries in the developing world have struggled with issues of electoral violence because of lack of credibility in the election institutions, the fact that they are biased, etc. And there has been substantial progress around the world because of these, issues and how much violence it comes again and again with the elections, in understanding that the only real solution to this is really create an autonomous, credible electoral institute that can solve these problems. I can attest to Mexico, for example, that I know very well. From 1982, when the elections began to be very competitive, there was a big fraud in 1988, a lot of violence happening in local elections where always there were claims of fraud, a lot of people killed around elections. This was really a never-ending story. And the way these credible sort of autonomous institutions began to be created is really paradoxical and interesting. The ruling party then knew that it was going to win the elections. This was in '94, but there was a very credible threat of one of his opponents contesting the results, regardless of whether he, was going to lose or win. And the government then didn't really want to risk that, so it created this very autonomous electoral institute run by 6 citizens who were very credible for the political parties. And the election was not contested. And after that, they made a really huge investment in Mexico. Has one of the most incredible electoral institutes that the current administration wants to undermine, by the way, talking about backsliding. But one of the issues that happens is that the results of the election arrive immediately at this sort of centralized station, and there is all the media, everyone is there concentrated, and the results can be really known by everyone in the moment in which they're being counted. There is a big bureaucracy, and then citizens in Mexico are trained every year, every time there is elections, citizens are mobilized and they are in charge of running the booths. So it's quite an impressive institution and organization in which, again, it's a very well-structured bureaucracy, but also this massive citizen participation. And this is something that the US should be thinking about, because the institutions are really not prepared. And this is going to be a problem over and over and over, with, claiming fraud. And as Trump really was the one who started this, but I don't see any solution unless you really strengthen those institutions.
Can I just say one thing on that, which is that the problem, this is not unique to the election domain, but it's particularly present there, which is that there is no institution that has bipartisan legitimacy anymore. Whether you point to the census or the CDC, the Fed is the one that everyone points to. That's barely hanging by a thread, right? So there's all these institutions. This is why we need to revitalize them.
Or create a new one,
Yeah, but this is the challenge,
yes.
Which is, because I deal with the election officials all the time. You've got appointed election officials, you've got bipartisan boards, you've got, like I deal with redistricting, as was said before. No one is trusted as the ultimate authority on this. This is true in the media as well, right? There's no one who's like Walter Cronkite right now who can say
the Weather Channel.
Weather Channel. Okay, there we go. We'll see. I don't know. I hear they're promoting climate change hoaxes, but so how did Walter Cronkite end his news shows? That's just the way it is. Well, there's nobody in the United States right now who can say that and be believed by all sides.
I think Lester Holt says, "Take care of one another," something like that, on NBC. But yeah, that's kind of benign, isn't it? Okay, I think there are a couple more questions out there. Nora, would you mind? Okay, and there's some up here at the front. Okay, Chelsea, why don't you do that one up at the front first, because I think they've been waiting for a bit. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Jeanette. I'm also a political science undergrad. And kind of building on his question, at Stanford, I run Stanford Democracy Day, which is kind of a campus-wide initiative.
Woohoo!
Yay! Actually, almost every group here and on stage is contributing, so we're really excited to be working with everyone. But I guess my question is, at Democracy Day, we work with people to hopefully try to get them to think about politics and elections differently, right? To make it not feel so the world is ending and more like people can do something about it. So kind of building on Monda's question of how it's going to be a while before we know, or maybe it's going to be a while before we know who's actually going to be the president. What do you suggest that kind of we do in that time? So whether it's the media do or as individuals or as groups, what do we do in that time to not try to like jump to conclusions ourselves, how to maintain confidence in that time or build community and spaces that can maintain
Are you
confidence?
above the drinking age?
No, I'm 20.
Because my recommendation might vary
don't
based on
worry.
that.
All right,
Yeah, yeah.
but before you answer that, let's take the question in the back and maybe one more, and then we'll come back to you.
Yeah, thanks for being here. My name is Gabby. I'm a CDDRL honors student.
Woo, Gabby.
Yay! Yeah, Beatrice is actually one of my advisors, so hi. I have a question for all of you. It's kind of related. I think on this note of trying to get voters engaged and mobilized, I think this election cycle has already had a lot of waves of like excitement and then it dies down again. So how would you recommend mobilizing voters? Are there alternative methods as opposed to just this, oh, the world is ending? Or I think Harris is trying to say like the new future rather than this apocalyptic view. And maybe, I guess, Beatriz, could you speak to, do you think there's any use in trying to compare to like things that are happening in Latino America? We're looking at Venezuela right now. Like, do you think that could be useful among particular communities? How do we go about that?
Okay, and one last question, I think. Yeah, Chelsea's right there.
I'm Owen. I'm in freshman undergrad, so I'm currently undeclared. This is a question for Shantu. You said
that's like political science code, basically, Mike.
you said that the only persuadable like people are undeclared or are undecided voters or independent voters.
Independents.
Do you think it's worth it to focus efforts on persuading independent voters to like vote a certain way, or should campaigns focus their efforts like specifically on getting out the vote for people within their party?
Yeah, the problem with focusing on independents is they tend to be somewhat low engagement types. They're not exactly junkies. And so they're hard to get to. So I doubt that there were too many independents in the debate last night. So essentially, it's sort of a cost effectively, you're much better off targeting mobilization attempts at people who are registered Democrats. So that's what the parties are doing.
Do you want to take Gabby's question and you want to say something to Jeanette about being optimistic and drinking? Okay.
Okay, I think this question also goes back to the issue of apathy, and I think this is really essential. I believe for young people especially, and I am also, a professor here, but I also have three kids who are around your age, a little bit older, and to me it's very clear that that's the other alternative. It's either I am partisan, but they don't convince me, so I'm not sure whether I really want to vote, and at some point I really don't want to show up. So the question that you raise is really important, because I think in these high-stake elections, which is exactly in polarized elections, you would assume that there is more turnout. Everybody wants to defend their side, but there is also this other alternative in which, there is really nothing that is being offered here that I like. So I think for young people, this is especially important. I saw that with, when Biden, left, I think there was a lot of enthusiasm around Kamala Harris among young people because of that. And I agree with you that it's waning. So I believe that remaining engaged and really, sort of voting is essential. And also conversations about politics and why it matters, comparing with other countries, why democracy really matters to defend it. I would imagine these are really important things you can do as.
May I just interject one thing as the Mossbacher director, and also as a parent and step parent of 4 in their 20s. I say to my kids, you don't vote, then you don't get the right to complain. So it's the easiest thing you can possibly do. You can do it from your home. Just fill it in, fill in your ballot. And I study countries where people have lost the right, where people die for the right to vote. And if you don't do it, I think it's dishonoring that it is a privilege, and our system will not function fundamentally, despite all of the other problems that keep Nate up at night, if you don't. And so, we only have ourselves to blame if we don't. So that's I used to take my kids with me when I voted into the ballot box. Not into the ballot box, pardon me, into the, into the polling station.
Yes.
They can't get in the ballot box. That would definitely be tampering with the elections, right, Nate? That would not count. That has never happened. Let's end that conspiracy theory now.
Stuff in
Do we,
This is going to be CDRL. You're going
Right,
to drop the
right.
democracy from the top. Look, the best way to mobilize people is to polarize them. Okay. And this is part of the problem, right? Which is that we are actually, and then you think everybody talks about apathy. You think that participation is going to solve these problems? No, participation was at a high watermark 4 years ago. Okay. And so that we think that the problem are just not, if only the right people turned out, or if only that we had 100% participation, that's going to solve these problems. But actually, we have pretty high participation by a historical standpoint right now. Now, that doesn't mean that, obviously there are different, young people in particular don't turn out to vote, but that's always been the case. There are lots of structural reasons why that is, and not to be registered. Over 85% of Americans who are registered are going to turn out to vote. Young people are more likely to be movers, and so therefore they're less likely to be registered. And so all those other indicia, demographic indicators about why someone might move and be socially mobile or geographically mobile are going to retard participation. And so that's not to say, all right, yeah, yay, polarization, let's do that, and because that will mobilize people, but that we always think that if only we could change the composition of the electorate and remedy this particular problem, then it's going to satisfy, say, the polarization problems that we think are endemic, that are harming, that are leading to lack of trust in the democracy. But I don't see that, and again, doesn't mean we shouldn't preach to high heaven that everyone should turn out to vote, particularly young people, and model it as democratic citizens and how critical it is to it. But in this election, I think we will have relatively high turnout because people understand what the stakes are.
Great. Thanks, Shanto. Any final responses on that or thoughts?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, I think polarization does boost turnout, but at the same time, given what we know about negative campaigning, that tends to turn people off. And so there are quite a few, I'm worried that there may be quite a few Democrats who, because of this barrage of attacks coming from the right, may decide that, maybe, might just sit this one out. And we know for sure that Democratic elasticity of turnout is higher among Democrats. That is to say, they are not as reliable in terms of getting out there no matter what.
So maybe counterbalanced by
I agree with you. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, what hurts turnout is Zoom. And we had about 116 people on Zoom, which is great. If you people on Zoom want to ask questions, then you should turn out here in the room next time. I just want to remind you that in 2 weeks, on Wednesday, October 16th, also at 4 p.m., here in Encina Hall, we will hold our second panel in this series featuring Brandis Keynes Roan, who's seated up here, Justin Grimmer, and Larry Diamond. So we'll look forward to seeing you there. And thank you all very, very much. Please join me in thanking our panelists.